Hi, my name's Michelle Bowdrowski. I'm a naturalist at Potawatomi Conservation, and I'm here at Hitchcock Nature Center where we're going to go on a nature hike. And specifically today we're going to be looking at the wildflowers that are blooming. Right now it's about midsummer, and these wildflowers will be blooming for a couple of weeks now. Some of them are a little bit past their prime and some of them are just getting started. And it's a little breezy today, so we might have to contend with the wind a little bit. Otherwise, let's go see what flowers we can find. So here's a plant that you'll find blooming in the mid to late summer. This is called a figwort, and the figwort we have blooming here at Hitchcock is called the late figwort because it blooms a little later in the year. These have tiny little unassuming flowers. They're two-petaled, and the petals are a maroonish to orangish color. Even though they're very small and they have itty-bitty tiny seeds, they're really important to our pollinators. The Xerces Society says that these are one of the most productive nectar plants that our pollinators can have. Pollinators will drink the nectar out of them and then they immediately refill with nectar. They make so much nectar. They do tend to get a little tall. This one, I'm about 5'3". This one's getting a little taller than I am, and they can get up to 8 foot. So if you have space in your yard or garden where you don't mind something who's not super grand looking but is super important for pollinators, figworts are a great addition. This is another very cool plant that we have growing here in the woodlands and woodland edges. This is called a lop seed. They call it a lop seed because the seeds that are growing here that have already bloomed and started ripening from the flowers, which is right here, they tend to become oppressed along the stem. Oppressed is another word for they just kind of lean against the stem. They kind of cuddle up to it instead of sticking straight out. That's why they call it the lop seed. They're lopped down. They're also really important to small little tiny sweat bees, kind of like the ones you see sitting on my arm right now. Little tiny bees, little tiny flowers. Up here we have a much bigger flower, taller than my own person. This is an American bellflower. These, along with the lop seed, started blooming in the spring, and they've been blooming for a long time. You can see they bloom all the way along the spike of flowers. So we do have some pods here and some flowers that are still blooming. This plant right here is a tick trefoil. You can see the leaves. It's in the pea family. You see the pea-like leaves down here. It's kind of a taller plant too, but then it's got these really pretty pea-style flowers on the end. A very pretty purpley pink. You can also see it has some Japanese beetle damage where they've chewed up holes all over the leaves, and there's still some Japanese beetles on it. A lot of people don't like Japanese beetles. I don't like them either, but they don't really cause a lot of problems in plant communities that are very diverse, have a lot of different plants. They mostly cause problems where people have yards that are completely lawn and maybe one or two of their favorite rose bushes or one or two different flowers, which those one or two different flowers become targets for the Japanese beetles when there's nothing else but lawn growing in that yard. So that's when you can completely lose a plant to Japanese beetles. If you've got a yard or a garden that's filled with different species of flowers and grasses, they can nibble a lot, cause some damage, but then they move on to another plant. So if you don't like Japanese beetles, don't have big lawns full of grass, because that's actually where they lay their eggs, and the Japanese beetle larvae eat the grass roots. Now we found a common evening primrose. They're also called sundrops because they have such beautiful, bright, intense yellow flowers. These flowers will bloom for one day, then fall off, and then they'll make this little capsule here that when it's ripe, it'll break open in different layers, usually about four like that, and then the seeds will come out. You can see this one also has some Japanese beetle damage, but this plant's still good because there's plenty of stuff around here for Japanese beetles to chew on. They also have a really sweet smell. People tend to like our non-native plants because they're usually really strongly smelling, real floral, but I think a lot of our wildflowers smell just as sweet. This is a really cool find. This is a pretty rare prairie plant. It's called Indian plantain. It's got these really interesting, unique purpley stems right here. These wide triangular leaves. And then a really interesting flower head. It's kind of umbel shaped. And then each of these is an individual flower. Really cool plant. Now we have a fuzzy little purple wildflower. This is Cory Vervain. They call it hoary because it has a very fuzzy leaf that has a little bit of a silvery sheen. So hoary, like hoarfrost. It has these really pretty spikes of flowers, and they bloom from the bottom and they continually bloom up and up, and the spike will get taller and taller. They'll bloom, 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 bloom to the very tip. This one also has some bug markings, some bug bites on it. May or may not be from Japanese beetles. Just goes to show you that these plants are eaten by our insect populations, and they're really important, not just to pollinators. These are Greyheaded Coneflowers. Can you see the inchworm pretending to be a stem? Little caterpillar eating the Greyheaded Coneflower. Other than having cool insects eating them, they're also really pretty plants. Like I said in my last video, just because you're pretty doesn't mean you're not super important. And our wildflowers here are very important for all of the animals we have in our food web. So Greyheaded Coneflower, they call them Greyheaded Coneflower when they're younger. These are a little bit past the beginning of their bloom season, but when they just start blooming, the cone head part is a kind of a pale light gray. And then it blooms, the flowers blooms, these are the disc flowers, and then the ray flowers. So once they bloom, it's harder to tell why they call them Greyheaded Coneflowers. But one of my favorite things about these is when they are done blooming and their seeds are mature in the fall, and you collect their seeds, this is a seed head from last year, they have the most fragrant seeds ever. They should totally make an incense or potpourri out of them. They smell very fragrant. So I encourage you, when you find these in the fall, if you collect some, make sure you take a big whiff of them. They smell so good. Here we have a very unique looking plant. This is called Snow on the Prairie. It's in the spurge family, so it has a milky white latex. And this very colorful white part here, these are actually bracts. So they're leaves underneath the flower itself, but they make the flowers look much bigger. The actual flowers are pretty small, and they're white as well. These are blooming at a time when a lot of the painted lady butterflies are moving around. And I've seen a lot of painted lady butterflies nectaring on these. They're just a really cool plant. This plant is often overlooked when it comes to wildflowers. It is called white vervain or nettle-leafed vervain. And the leaves do look somewhat like nettle leaves. They don't sting like a nettle leaf would because it's not a nettle. It is in the Vervain family, kind of like hoary vervain with the bright purple flowers. But these have tiny little white flowers on the tips here. And they still, even though they're tiny and small, they're still important, and pollinators will use them for pollen and nectar. This is one of the purpliest purple plants of all the purple plants that I've ever seen in my life, and I like to look at plants. This is Ironweed, and it is another one of our just wonderful looking late summer, fall blooming natives. I love the way it has these really dark foliage and the just intense, almost ultraviolet purple flowers. And then even the seed heads, which these are going to be the seed heads they've already bloomed, they still have a bit of the purple tinge to them, kind of a gold purple. And they're just really, really beautiful. Another great plant to have in your landscape or in your gardens. So we have found kind of a late blooming elderberry. These are usually blooming more early summer, and by now they're usually putting on berries. So this is a shrub. It gets about its tall, like, I don't know, what's that, 7 foot tall or so? They can get 7 or 8 foot tall. They're very fragrant. I really like the way they smell, and the berries are edible, but you usually have to compete with all the other wild animals if you want to be a wild animal and eat their berries. People make jams out of them, wine. Another great plant for wildlife. Here's one of my favorites. This is Partridge Pea. One of the reasons I really like it is because they are one of the first plants that really get established in a new planting when you're doing prairie reconstruction. They come in really thick, the partridge pea, and then throughout the years as the plant community evolves and has new species come in, they kind of fade away a little bit, but in the beginning you can just see fields of yellow because they come in so thick. They are a pea, it's in their name. So they do have cute little pea leaves and really pretty, interesting flowers. Let's see one that's not faded. There we go. Yellow with the dark colored anthers with the pollen, and then they have a little bright splash of red down the middle. They're just so cute. I don't know, something about them I just really like. This very tall, very majestic plant is our compass plant. It is in the aster family. It is very prickly. It's not like a cactus, but the stem is quite prickly. It's got these pretty cool bright yellow flowers and these amazing, very outstanding leaves. I just think they are the coolest leaves ever. They're very scratchy, like sandpaper, and really stiff, so they feel really strong. And they call it compass plant because they tend to orient themselves north and south to keep the blazing part of the sun off them during the day. It's just a really, really cool